Coming up, an inside look at the Obama administration.
So I see a difference. Obama doesn't torture people. Obama announces legal standards. Obama's trying to close Guantanamo.
Former State Department legal advisor Harold Koh discusses his ethical upbringing and his time in Washington. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
We are very fortunate to have with us this evening Harold Koh. Harold is an exemplar of a great American tradition of moving back and forth between the world of law and legal scholarship and public service. Harold is one of America's leading authorities on international law, human rights law, and was the dean of Yale Law School. At the same time, he served in the Reagan administration, the Clinton administration, and the Obama administration as counselor to the State Department, where he was responsible for the whole range of issues involving the war on terror, among other things. And so, Harold, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I want to ask you just first a little bit about how you came to do what you do. So we were just talking beforehand about your family. Harold's father was a highly regarded Korean diplomat who was here during the moment of a coup, and rather than return and work for the new government, took a vow that he would not work for that government and never did so. So I take it that questions of conscience were really a profound thing for you growing up, since this was the example you had before you.
Yeah, so my dad was probably the first Korean to study law in America, and he very much wanted to serve a democratic government in Korea. What happened was that he became the charge, the number 2 guy, but the acting ambassador in Washington. There was a military coup, and everybody in the embassy got together one night in 1961. They vowed that they would never serve the military government. And my dad was the only guy who kept the promise. And by the way, the other people went on to great positions of importance in the military government. And my dad was a college teacher, and I asked him once, do you ever regret your choice? And he said, there'll always be people in these jobs. Nobody will remember them because they don't stand for anything. If you stand for something, people will remember you even if you're not in these jobs. So that's been sort of my motto, I hope.
You became a lawyer, but beyond that, you obviously went into a kind of morally driven aspect of the law. So I take it that that is part of that inheritance, that you did a thing that had to do with serving social justice.
Well, I think Koreans have a slogan, theory without practice is as lifeless as practice without theory is thoughtless. And it makes me feel uncomfortable to be just a professor without actually practicing. When I was in college with you, Jim, one day I was in a class and they started talking about in and outers, people who go back and forth. And they mentioned, Henry Kissinger, Ken Galbraith, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Robert Strauss-Hoope, Lincoln Gordon. So I wrote a paper about it, and I thought, hey, this is a good thing. You never get bored. So
the thing that I think most people or some people know about is that you were involved with representing Haitians who had been interned at Guantanamo. If maybe you can take either that or just one other example to give us a sense of the fusion of academic interest and activism that you were engaged in.
So the students at Yale Law School wanted to start a human rights clinic, which was essentially a law firm. 1990, we started it, and we did some human rights cases, but mostly writing amicus briefs, which are not contested. And then the first Bush administration started bringing Haitian refugees to Guantanamo. We worked on Haitian refugees. There was at one point 30,000 there. The next year, Cuban refugees came, and I decided to represent them, and I went back down there then. There were about 40,000 there. I went back again to represent Chinese refugees. And at my last birthday, my wife pointed out that I had been working on issues surrounding Guantanamo for something like 17 of the past 21 birthdays, which was pretty shocking. And so I've now seen a lot more of Guantanamo than I'd ever care to see.
Maybe you should also just talk briefly about your service. So Harold was the Assistant Secretary of State for democracy, human rights, and labor in the Clinton administration. And that's especially the democracy promotion job in the Clinton administration. Was it a meaningful part of Clinton's tenure?
Oh, I think it was. So I worked for Madeleine Albright, who had a very similar background to my own, and we had a deep friendship which continues to this day. We worked on the Balkans, we worked on Kosovo. That's where I met Dick Holbrooke, who I continue to view as a tremendous figure in diplomacy. We worked on Sierra Leone. I went to North Korea with Albright, which was a mind-boggling experience. You know, I think America to the world is a beacon. I've said this before, but my mother, when Korea was divided, was actually in a house in North Korea, and it was only through a miracle that she got out. And when I flew from North Korea to the South with Albright, we took off and we're in total darkness. And that's because North Korea, they can't feed themselves, they don't have any electricity. And in less than 30 miles, you're over Seoul, which is just glowing with lights. And these are the same people. The only difference is the political system they've existed under. You know, Koreans who cannot motivate themselves to feed themselves, think about that. That's a shocking thought. And then you land and you're in the world of Gangnam Style. And I remember thinking, what more proof do I need that democracy makes a difference? And it's a world of darkness and a world of light.
So let's move forward to 2009. You take this position with the Obama administration. And I take it in some really fundamental way, it was harder than the Clinton job. The Clinton job was very much consonant with your own principles. Here you had to find a way of dealing with really tough issues involving things like targeted killing, detention, and so forth, things that you were not naturally comfortable with. Did you just find this difficult?
Well, in the human rights job, I was an internal advocate and pushing for the human rights position. As a legal advisor, I had to give my opinion as to whether things are lawful or not. And there are policy calls being made. So you can say one of three things. It's lawful, it's unlawful, or sometimes it's lawful but policy unwise, or as we call it, lawful but awful. And you know, if something's lawful but awful, and the policymaker wants to do it, you could say, I think it's a bad idea, but it's still their choice. And if your client is Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or both, they get a chance to choose from among the lawful options.
But you put that, Harold, in a very cool way. I mean, in one of your speeches, you made the point that part of your job was to be a conscience, that, as you said, I guess just now, that it was also a question of what was wise, what was moral. Were there moments that you can think of now where you came out inside the administration on the side of, this is legal, but it's wrong, and we shouldn't be doing it?
I didn't usually say it's wrong. I said this is legal, but it's not the best option.
Can you think of an example where that was the case?
I can think of a number.
Can you mention one that you can think of?
No, but when Secretary Clinton asked me to do the job, I said I have two conditions. I said if there is a widespread return of refugees, I will quit because I spent my life working on this. Second, I said I have to be at the table for every important decision. And if I'm overruled, I can defend the decision if I was there. But if I didn't know about it, I can't defend it. So she said, you'll be there.
And you were?
She always lived up to it.
Did you wind up taking positions that you wouldn't have thought you would have taken beforehand because the world looked a lot more dangerous from the inside than it had looked to you from the outside?
Well, when you're in the government, you're receiving constant threat streams. I mean, literally every day you read about threats and close calls and things that didn't quite happen. You know, when I'm a professor, and I am again now, I memorize the names of all my students, and I know their backgrounds and their aspirations. Shortly after I got to the State Department, I was looking at a list and I realized I have to memorize the names of all of the Al-Qaeda senior leadership. And guess what? They're the same age as my students. And the most emotional moment was one guy who was born on the same day as my daughter, the exact same day. And I just spent about an hour and a half looking at his curriculum vitae, we might say. And I remember the day she went to the prom, he was initiated into Al-Qaeda. And on another day, he led a suicide strike. And yeah, he was really involved in dozens and dozens of plots. He was a very able person. And to think, here's my daughter, here's this guy, two different set of life opportunities. It wasn't clear to me that he would do anything other than what he was doing. And we're not talking about propaganda. We're talking about building bombs, creating delivery mechanisms, sending emails that you could read that were pretty unmistakable in their intent.
One of the things that you rendered legal decisions about and have since been reproached for by some of your former colleagues in the legal community was the whole area of targeted killings. And it's clear from what you say that you cannot think of that question the way an academic would if you're the person sitting there looking at this real example of a real person. So I assume that changes you when you're in that position.
Well, you certainly feel responsible, and you certainly feel determined to do it correctly. So, first of all, the laws of war, some people said to me, how can you criticize torture and defend the legality of targeted killing in certain circumstances? And the answer is pretty simple, that torture is always illegal, no matter when done. The laws of war distinguish between lawful and unlawful killing. So the job of the lawyer is to say, this killing is lawful because it's against a enemy with whom we're in armed conflict, and this one's illegal because it's not. So you have to draw these lines, and that means you have to know who these individuals are, not just label them, but what they've actually done. And then you have to determine whether it would be lawful to target them.
You talked about the laws of war, and there's something very unusual about the kind of war that we're talking about now. So does this pose a problem that the laws of war were not exactly designed for? Because the war on terror could be going on for the foreseeable future, and it could involve a battlefield anywhere in the world because those adversaries can be anywhere in the world.
So I reject the term war on terror. There is no such thing. The Obama administration has never used that term. The term is the armed conflict with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban and associated forces. They're the people who attacked us on September 11th. On September 18th, 2001, Congress passed a statute declaring war on those people. And under the laws of war, we're in a non-international armed conflict with that non-state actor. And the Supreme Court so said in a decision that it is lawful to, in the course of this armed conflict, attack those people and to try to defeat them, detain them if possible, and if not, as in the case of bin Laden, to kill them. You may not like it, or I don't like it.
Okay, but I just want to press this point because, again, whatever the nomenclature is, the authorization that was created by the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, which applies to, as you say, organizations that either did or were associated with those who carried out 9/11, means that all sorts of other organizations that themselves had nothing to do with 9/11, but that choose to put the words AQ in their title, AQAP, AQ, in different parts of the world, in North Africa and Yemen and elsewhere, they're also part of that. So isn't that
not necessarily, Jim.
So this is a distinction that has some of these AQs might be and some of these AQs might not be.
So I'm a lawyer, and the term, what we apply is a test of Cobelligerency, which means that the group actually has to have entered the conflicts against the United States alongside Al-Qaeda. Now, some of them, AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, clearly has done so, to the extent to which they're under the command and control of Zawahiri, who is the current leader. If he gives an order, they will attack. And they have aspirations against the United States. But that is quite a small group. Now, I would distinguish somebody like Tsarnaev, the guy in Boston. These people are sympathizers or emulators, but they're not part of Al-Qaeda. So here's the great irony. If instead of invading Iraq instead of torturing people, instead of opening Guantanamo, instead of doing extraordinary renditions. The focus had been on attacking the core of al-Qaeda when they were concentrated in Afghanistan. This could well be over 10, 15 years ago.
I want to ask about that because you've often made the point that Bush carried out his war on terror with indifference, sometimes contempt for international law and for legal principle in general, and that Obama is extremely conscious of that, and you wouldn't have served there if he weren't. So the process is radically different between the two. But the outcome seems less radically different than the process does. So could you explain why it is important in itself to be law-observing, even if you wind up coming to a similar outcome to the one that this non-law-observing person came to?
Well, here's how I think of it, Jim, which is, I go like this. You know, there's a fork in the road, and they take the wrong road. If you're an academic here, you say, here's where the mistake was made. My analysis is over. You can't go back. If you're in the government, you say, they went down the wrong road. Now, how are we going to get from the wrong path to this path? And it takes a long time. You know, I was very opposed to the invasion of Iraq. I thought it was illegal. Our soldiers were there. When I went there, I worked for 2 years on all the aspects of disengagement. And during that whole period, people are saying, you're doing the exact same thing as your predecessors, except at the end, we were out of Iraq. So you are actually deviating the road and getting back to the right place, but from people who are looking from the outside, they see no difference. So I see a difference. Obama doesn't torture people. Obama announces legal standards. Obama's trying to close Guantanamo. He's not completely successful, but he's making progress. Obama is willing to bring cases in civilian courts. Obama has closed black sites. He doesn't do extraordinary renditions. And most fundamentally, he's trying to get out of Iraq, Afghanistan, and he's trying to end the war with al-Qaeda. He hasn't succeeded, but by the way, if he gets those things done, or even most of them done, that's a substantial change.
My question is specifically on the responsibility to protect. I know you had mentioned that Obama made a mistake by saying that there was a red line and not necessarily taking action in terms of Assad's use of chemical weapons. What is your position in terms of the United States facing a situation where there's a country that uses weapons of mass destruction against its own people internally? Is there a way to go about the UN Security Council where there's one member that's persistently vetoing a resolution that would call for action?
What I actually said, and it's a blog called justsecurity.org, is that Obama's red line is not his personal red line, it's the world's red line. It's a legal red line. And I do think it's a red line in that do we really want to go back to a period where people are using per se illegal weapons? Now, as I understand it, and maybe I've got it wrong, the statement, this is a red line, was supposed to be made in a formal way.
That's a red line for us, and that there would be enormous consequences if we start seeing movement on the chemical weapons front.
And that it would be combined by going to members of Congress and getting them to agree that if the red line were breached, they'd act together, and going to our allies and also saying the same. Instead, that speech was not given, and the president said it in an interview, at which it just sounded like a point of personal preference, and none of the collateral politicking and prep work was done. So that when the moment came, when it became clear, August 21st, that there had been, a large-scale, when the red line was clearly breached, it was impossible to get the kind of either multilateral or congressional support for it that was necessary. So the principle was right, but the politics didn't support it. And, that's a tragedy.
So if I could follow up that R2P question. So, and of course, Obama has very much embraced the responsibility to protect as a principle. But I remember he was interviewed, I think maybe in the New Republic, and they said, you are a believer in this principle of the responsibility to protect, but you haven't acted in Syria. And he said, well, okay, millions of people have been killed in Congo and couldn't act there, and so there's no way of being consistent on this question. And that struck me as a kind of disingenuous thing for him to say. That is, isn't it clear that if you're going to have a principle like this, you're going to be inconsistent, and you'll intervene where you can, and you won't where you can't. And so I take it the fact that you can't successfully intervene in some places is not a justification for your not intervening anywhere at all.
No, I agree. The fact that you can't always do the right thing everywhere doesn't mean that you shouldn't do the right thing when you can and where it will make a difference. And I think Obama did that in Libya, and frankly didn't get a lot of credit for it. In fact, he got criticized for, quote, leading from behind, when in fact I think thousands of lives were saved, and you know, it was a thing that brought about the end of the Gaddafi regime.
What about the war powers question on Libya? I mean, you're someone who wrote, I believe, when in the run-up to the Persian Gulf War, you would, I think, wrote something that said that the first President Bush was wrongly stating that he did not need Congress's affirmative approval in order to be able to go to war against Iraq. Now, Obama did not feel he needed Congress's affirmative approval in order to not go to war, in order to engage in hostilities against Libya. So why was the one wrong and the other one okay?
Because one was a major offensive war that was at a very grand scale, and the other was the U.S. participating in a supporting role in a civilian protection mission in which the height of the military activity was in the first couple of days, and then it dropped down to a very low level for the rest of the way. So there's a factual distinction. Now, the key on the War Powers Resolution was we had three options going forward. One is do nothing, in which case tens of thousands of people would have been killed in Benghazi. There's little doubt about it. Threats were being made, et cetera. The second is to go to Congress and get their approval, when in fact most of the key leaders had said that they didn't think that the War Powers Resolution applied, and they wouldn't give the approval. So going to Congress was also the equivalent of doing nothing, which I think would have led to tens of thousands of people dying. The third possibility is to challenge the constitutionality of the War Powers Resolution, which Senator McCain was urging, which I think would have created a constitutional crisis at a moment where the real battle was saving thousands of civilian lives. The choice that we applied was we don't challenge the constitutionality of this statute. We read the statute in light of its precedents. We find that this doesn't rise to the level of hostilities as in other cases. And I looked very carefully that this was something like the 7th or 8th lowest amount of use of violence. And the other cases, the other 8 cases, were also not deemed to be hostilities. So here's a situation where the mission was limited, the exposure of U.S. soldiers was 0, where the exposure of U.S. ground forces was 0, where the risk of escalation was controlled, and where the military means used was very limited. That's not Vietnam. And in the internal debates, I said, I'm sorry, the War Powers Resolution is a no more Vietnam statute. It's not a let's have many more Rwanda statute.
What's the legal basis for the obligation of our country and Americans to observe international law? Does it have to do with the UN Charter?
So first of all, it's a founding credo of the country. When the Declaration of Independence says, you know, when we dissolve our bonds with our colonial founders, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, ask us to state the reasons that impelled the separation. The United States, as a small country, basically got legitimacy in the world by obeying international law and treaties. I mean, if you look at a new country now, like Southern Sudan or East Timor, they all start by proclaiming their fidelity to international law. So that was a founding principle of what we did. And then, the early years of the Republic, John Marshall ruled on many, many more cases under international law than he did under U.S. law, because frankly, there was very little U.S. federal law and U.S. constitutional law. As an international matter, we were bound by specific rules in the UN Charter, but also bound by rules of jus cogens and other kinds of more technical legal concepts. So for example, the United States did not ratify the Genocide Convention for 40 years after we signed it. But I don't think we were legally free to commit genocide in the interim. Now, Lou Henkin, the great Columbia law professor, I think correctly said, most nations obey most rules of international law most of the time. And in fact, that's been empirically tested. The question is, do they violate it in the big case? And if so, are they forced to pay a remedy? But in the US government, there is intensive debate over international law. There's somehow a perception that people say, oh, forget it. It's not so. There's elaborate discussion, exchanges of memos, debates, very high quality intellectual argument of the kind that if people saw it going on, they would realize how seriously we're taking legal obligations.
There are Supreme Court justices who would answer this gentleman's question. I take it in a very different way, that in fact they would say the United States should not be bound by international law or should not use international law in the Supreme Court's jurisprudence.
Well, I think that's both illegal and mistaken. I took an oath as a government official 3 times to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States of America. Those include treaties of the United States. Those include customary international law rules that are part of our law. I didn't think I had any freedom to ignore those rules.
Well, Harold, thank you so much. This has really been incredibly edifying.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.